What is up, everybody? Mr. Curtis here. Welcome to 6.3. We're doing effects of the Cold War today. Remember, the Cold War is between the United States, which is democratic and capitalist, and the Soviet Union, which is totalitarian and communist. And the two never directly fight each other, but they do send soldiers to fight in wars across the world. They do send influence and try and spread their beliefs and ideas to different places. And this today, what we're going to look at is what are called proxy wars. These are wars that either the US or the Soviet Union get involved in to spread either democracy, which is the US, or communism, which is the Soviet Union. And what a proxy war refers to in general is it's a war between two groups in a smaller country. So in this case, these wars are all going to be between a communist group and a democratic group. And the two sides are going to try and fight each other. And if the U.S. is fighting, they're trying to either send soldiers in to fight against the communist group or vice versa with the Soviet Union. This is going to occur throughout the Cold War. And we're going to look at three different areas. One is Korea right here. One is Afghanistan right here. And the other is Cuba, where all three of these places are going to be kind of hot spots or proxy wars that are fought over the interests of the United States and the Soviet Union. So again, a proxy is just someone who represents you on your behalf. And in this case, we're talking proxy wars. So here's our first example, which is Korea. Korea is located right here in East Asia. It is sandwiched in between. It's a horrible location for a country. They are located between China, Russia, and Japan, who are three historically powerful areas and powerful regions, which makes Korea easy to be taken over or have to constantly be people trying to take them over. And in the 1930s, before World War II, that's exactly what happened. And Japan has fully conquered Korea, the entire peninsula, which was one country at the time. And after Japan loses World War II, they're kicked out of Korea. And the question becomes around the world, what do we do with this country? Who's in charge? What's the government structure like? And remember, after World War II, we have the Soviet Union and the communist side and the democratic side, which is the US, France, and Britain. And they come to an agreement. We talked about the conferences of Yalta and Potsdam, that they are going to split it in half. So they take the 38th parallel here, which if you know your geography, that's right there. And they're going to split it between the North, which is communist, and the South, which is democratic. And the North's capital is going to be this capital called Pyongyang, and the South is going to be Seoul. So they split it in half. And everyone's like, oh, this is going to work out great, whatever. And in 1950, so this happens in 1945, 46, 47. And by 1950, the Soviet Union, the USSR, supports the North and sends them weapons and military aid and whatnot. And those North Korean communist soldiers invade the South. And they invade the South. And then the U.S. says, we can't let North Korea take over the entire Korean peninsula. We have to do something about it, because the belief at the time in the United States was if any country falls to communism in this region, it's going to be like dominoes, where not the pizza place, like dominoes as in you set up the dominoes and you knock one over and then all the other ones fall down. The belief in the United States was if we let one country in this region fall to communism, the whole entire region is going to go communist. So we have to do something to stop it. So the U.S. sends 326,000 soldiers into this peninsula to help push back the North Korean soldiers and to push back north, to push them back into the communist side. The war lasts for 4 years, so 50, 51, 52, 53. There's a truce that's signed, an armistice. They don't actually end the war. They just agree to stop fighting. They're actually still officially at war today. And they create a little zone here called the demilitarized zone. All this stuff we'll talk a little bit more about in class, where no soldiers are allowed in this. But the issue today is that it is still a totalitarian government. This is the current leader, who I'm sure everyone's heard of, Kim Jong-un. As totalitarian, it is probably the closest thing that we could see in a country to like a Stalin or a Hitler, in a sense, of those totalitarian leaders of the 1930s. They also have nuclear weapons. They have multiple, anywhere between 4 to 8 nukes at this point, and they're developing more. We still, as the United States, this is still ongoing. If you know anyone who's a lifetime member of the armed forces, they've traveled around the world. They've probably been to Korea at some point. We have 20,000 soldiers in South Korea as of today. So this is still going on. We'll talk a lot more about this. Really interesting place. Interesting how the two sides are separated. But that's Korea. Again, the U.S. sends soldiers in. The Russians send food and aid and military supplies to help the Soviet Union. Second example, we're in Latin America here, is Cuba. just a little contextualization or historical circumstance on this. There's years of Cuban history or decades of a corrupt government. The government was stealing money from people, whatever, and they were backed by the United States. So the government was not very popular. It was kind of ripe for an overthrow, and it's 90 miles away from the United States. So if you've ever been to Key West to Havana is only 90 miles, so it's super short. And we talk about like nuclear weapons, and at this time, the Soviet Union couldn't send a nuke all the way over the United States. But this fear grows. In 1959, a revolution happens. And this guy by the name of Fidel Castro, who is borderline communist at the time, a little more socialist, but another story for another day. He wins a revolution in Cuba. They fight against the corrupt government and they win. And they promise, hey, we're going to get rid of foreign businesses. All these American businesses here, all these foreign businesses are here. We're going to get rid of it. And we're going to equality for all, equality for women, equality for those of you who are poor farmers. Everyone's going to be equal. And this freaks out the United States. This talk of equality and taking control of businesses sounds communist to the United States, and the U.S. doesn't like it. So the U.S. plans an invasion of Cuba. And what they do is they train a bunch of Cuban Americans, Cubans who have left Cuba and have moved to the United States, especially during this revolution, and they train them, and the CIA trains them to secretly invade Cuba. So they fly them in, they drop them in parachutes, they send them into this area called the Bay of Pigs, and Castro had known about it, and it ends up being a huge disaster. These guys are captured, they're imprisoned, and it looks like an embarrassment for the United States because these guys were supposed to come in and try and overthrow the government. It doesn't work. So the next year, things ramp up and get even worse in 1962 as the Soviet Union sneaks nuclear weapons into Cuba. And again, we're talking 90 miles away. This is an area that you could easily send a nuclear weapon from Havana to Miami at this point. So it scares them. It's fearful for the United States. And it leads to what is almost 2 weeks of crazy tension where we were this close to a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and an agreement's made at the last minute. And the agreement is that if the U.S. agrees to leave Cuba alone and to let Cuba run as they should, then the Soviet Union will get rid of all the nukes in Cuba. And the agreement's made, and the U.S. pretty much holds to it outside of the multiple assassination attempts that the U.S. government had against Castro. And a couple other things. But for the most part, we did not try and invade them again. And that was the last time. So that's number two. And number three, and we're moving quick here, so I'm sorry, this is really, really fast, is Afghanistan. This is not the Afghanistan war of 2001. This is the Afghanistan war of the 1970s and 80s. There's a group, Afghanistan, here's the Soviet Union, and here's all of their areas. And they're trying to expand in the 1970s, and they push into Afghanistan here. And the U.S., had supported Afghanistan after World War II, and in 1979, the similar to what we talked about with Cuba, but the opposite, the government was corrupt that was supported by the Soviet Union. There's a group that tries to overthrow that government, and a war breaks out, almost a civil war in Afghanistan. The U.S. is going to support the non-communist side. They are referred to as the Mujahideen. Can't even say that today. And we provide them with weapons. So we're not sending soldiers there, but we're providing with weapons to fight against the Soviet Union. If you're getting the theme here, you either send weapons, you send soldiers, and in this case, the U.S. is sending weapons, and the Soviet Union is going to send soldiers. Just a side note to this, one of these leaders is a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden. He's going to come up later, but this Mujahideen we are going to support because we believe that they are anti-communist, which they were. So we give them weapons, we give them military aid, and they actually end up pushing the Soviet Union out. The Soviet Union gets stuck in Afghanistan for 11 years. It was a horrible idea to invade them. It's a rugged, treacherous terrain. It's very hard to unify it. And as a result of this, the money that they spend in Afghanistan is eventually going to lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, similar to the U.S. losing in Afghanistan as well, which is another story for another day. So 3 places: Korea, Cuba, Afghanistan, proxy wars. That's the theme here. You got any questions? Write it down. Let me know. I'm out.